I would like to begin by welcoming all of you, Ripon College students, staff, faculty, and members of the wider community in the city of Ripon and beyond, to tonight's keynote speech for Ripon College's celebration of the 2018 Martin Luther King Jr. Week. This year's theme is Deflate the Hate, and it is inspired by the rise of politically motivated violent extremism in the United States over the last decade. For example, according to the Anti-Defamation League's report, Murder and Extremism in 2017, murders by white supremacists in the United States doubled from 2016 to 2017. And although, according to the same report, total murders by domestic extremists in the United States declined by more than half from 2016 to 2017, 2017 was still the fifth worst year since 1970. The worst was 1995, when Timothy McVeigh and others bombed the Arthur P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. The second and third worst years were 2015 and 2016. In other words, 3 of the 5 worst years are just the last 3. FBI data also showed that the number of hate crimes in the U.S. rose in both 2015 and 2016, with more than 6,000 incidents nationwide in 2016 alone. According to police data compiled by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, the number of hate crimes in cities of more than 250,000 inhabitants rose by a further 19.9%, almost 20% in 2017. And the exact scope of the problem is difficult to determine because of inconsistent reporting by both victims and law enforcement agencies, and because terms like hate crime and terrorism are defined differently by different people. For example, when in 2015, Dylan Roof killed 9 African Americans worshiping in a Charleston church explicitly because they were black, he was later convicted on 33 counts of hate crimes, but the FBI concluded that the incident did not qualify as terrorism. Similarly, when Stephen Paddock killed 58 people in Las Vegas this past October, this obviously hateful and criminal act was not officially counted as either a hate crime or terrorism because his motives were unknown. Another problem is that some acts of hate get more attention in the media than others do, leading to very skewed impressions of where this violence is coming from. According to a 2015 report by the New America Research Center, between 2002 and 2015, more Americans were killed by non-Muslim political extremists than were by Muslims. In 2013, a study by the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security concluded that from 2002 to 2013, only 11% of politically motivated or mass killings in the United States were perpetrated by Muslim Americans. Martin Luther King was himself perhaps the most famous victim of hate crimes in the United States, including not only his assassination in 1968, but numerous other assaults on him as well. In addition, in 1965 and 1966, 2 separate Gallup polls showed that most Americans had an unfavorable view of Dr. King. And the FBI had King under close surveillance and indeed harassed him severely for many years because they saw him as subversive. Our speaker tonight, Sammy Rangel, has dedicated his life to combating hate. Born in Texas and raised mainly in Illinois before settling in Racine, Wisconsin, Mr. Rangel was caught in the revolving door of the criminal justice system from a very young age and spent several years in prison. Prisons are breeding grounds for violent extremism, and group violence in prison settings is usually organized along racial or ethnic lines. Mr. Rangel himself often talks about how he got caught up in a prison race riot. Since his release from prison, Mr. Rangel has gone to college and gotten both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in social work. He has played a leading role in some of the most successful programs in the United States when it comes to preventing ex-convicts from ending up in prison again. He has also co-founded the organization Life After Hate, which is devoted to combating the rise of hate groups and violent extremism in the United States. In 2016, Life After Hate received a $250,000 grant from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to support their work. The following year, the new presidential administration rescinded that grant and moved toward eliminating counterterrorism programs that dealt with white supremacists, preferring to focus solely on Islamic jihadists. Mr. Rangel is an old friend of Ripon College, having given talks here on at least 3 previous occasions. He has worked especially closely with Ripon College Professor of Communications Jody Roy, co-authoring the book Forebears, Myths of Forgiveness. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. Rangel combats hate with love and understanding, seeing all people as redeemable. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Sammy Rangel.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Good. Thank you for joining us on a late evening. I know it's cold outside. I myself came back from Florida yesterday where it was 75 degrees. I was sweaty and burning up, and then came back to see like all this snow piled up in my yard. And I was actually out there doing a crisis intervention with a white supremacist we have recently helped exit his hate group, originally from Idaho, but was kind of hiding out and laying low-key in Florida. And he was in crisis, and so I ended my trip in New York early to fly out there to see him yesterday. And I got home last night about midnight, maybe 1 o'clock, and was awake before the sun came up to make my way out here. Being a person who is advocating for others and to try to make the world, safer. I mean, and I do mean the world. I don't just use that. It takes tireless effort and energy. But when we see faces like what we're seeing right now, it reminds us why we're out there doing what we do. So I'm grateful that Ripon has taken up this cause. Jody is a long-term friend, not only of myself, but of all the founders, all the co-founders of Life After Hate, especially Frankie Mink, who some of you might know very well. Without people believing in us and believing in the potential to change, being here wouldn't be possible. And we'll talk a little bit about my success and what I'm doing. If you can give me a moment, we've had some technical difficulties. As you see, there's no laptop up here, so I'm going to access the same PowerPoint off my phone so that I don't have to turn my back on you and look at the screen every day. So just bear with me. Hopefully I have enough of a signal to open up that file. And as the professor was reading his introduction, I was like, man, he put that together than potentially the whole presentation I did. Like you were out there quoting some heavy-duty reports and figures and statistics, man. Way to raise the bar for me. I appreciate that. Last minute. I want to talk a little about some of the affiliations I have, as many of us who are in the work of doing this effort, combating violent extremism. I don't necessarily want you to think that I'm out there fighting against anyone or fighting against anything. In fact, what we're doing is we're really fighting for. And we're even fighting for the men and women who are in these groups that create these newsworthy incidences and events. And whether it's around racism, whether it's like the Las Vegas shooting, which is yet to be defined by this country, whether it's Dylan Roof, whether it's Michael Wade Page, whether it's what we just saw in New York, whether it's the 15-year-old kid who just killed 2 students and wounded many others, all of those lives are hanging in the balance, and so are those communities. And we have to be concerned about everyone, and concerned not at the expense of others, including the men and women and the youth who are perpetrating these acts of hate. These acts of violence, and we're going to get into that somewhat. I'm going to ask you some questions that are going to resonate with you, and I'll remind you to think about these questions as we move forward. But this is to help us develop what I would say is a shared language and a shared understanding. When we are trying to define, you talked about the many definitions. The federal government can't even agree on the definitions of violent extremism, of terrorism, of hate crimes. And in fact, the reports that you were citing from the FBI and the ADL, you should know that while those reports indicate a rise, the vast majority of states in the United States do not report hate crimes to a single database where that can be tracked. These happen to be reports just from the few states that choose to participate in reporting hate crimes. So you can assume that those numbers are even higher. Having said that, how many of you have ever heard of the term that said Everything happens for a reason, right? It's a pretty common term. But when we think about what that question or what that statement implies, it's almost referring to this anonymous third-party figure, this third-person figure, isn't it? It's as if these things are happening to us by somebody else's plan. Having said that, who is writing your story? Just think that through. And does the way you tell yourself your story, does it matter? For example, getting off of a plane in 75-degree weather and then stepping on the tarmac, coming back into the parking structure, and I'm like in 20-degree weather. Do you think I had a few explicitives to talk about what I was experiencing in that moment? And did that alter and shape my reality about what I was coming back to? Right? Do you think that the way I told myself the story about the mistake I made from coming back from Florida, do you think that that impacts the next few steps, the next few thoughts, the next few emotions, the next few moments? You know, like when we wake up and we're having a bad day, did it have anything to do with how we put our feet on the ground? And if so, why are we telling our story, and why are we telling it this way? When you think about why we talk about the stories that we have, ask yourself if you've ever had an agenda before you even told the story. Let's talk about breakups. I'm going to assume some of you know something about breakups, right? When you went to go tell your best friend about what just happened, tell me you weren't going to paint that story as horrible as you could, and even though you knew the person was going to be on your side, you really wanted to make sure they were really, really on your side, right? And so you start to, you might leave out details that make you look bad and make the other person look worse, right? We have oftentimes an agenda for telling a particular story. We're either trying to rally the troops around us, we're trying to encourage or discourage something. We typically have a reason why we tell the story a particular way. And especially when we talk about race issues, especially when we talk about religion, especially when we talk about politics, we are trying to make either the best case or the worst case with every story we tell around those topics. But you have to ask yourself, why are we doing that? What is our intention when we tell the story that way? And do you think that the way you tell this story, does it influence the outcomes? I work a lot with corrections. I work a lot with law enforcement. And the power of the pen is mighty in those fields. The power of the pen in counseling as a therapist is mighty. It can change and alter the course of another person's life with just a stroke. So imagine how I'm talking about clients. Imagine how I'm talking about the people and communities I serve or the people that I have to detain. Does the way I tell myself my story about my experience in these worlds shape the outcomes? For example, there's a period of time when I worked at the county jail as an AODA counselor. And I was working with men and women who had drug and alcohol issues, and they were on parole. And this was an alternative, what they call an alternative to revocation, meaning that this person was like on a last chance. If they could complete this program, they could avoid being returned to prison for the rule violation. And it was completely up to the case manager at that time to determine a person's worthiness of being in the program. And that worthiness was evaluated by their ability to disclose, by their ability to talk about what was going on in their life in a truthful, straightforward, transparent manner. You know, were they being honest? Were they telling lies? Was it like pulling teeth? Were they open? Whether they could follow the rules, whether they were completing their homework and assignments, things like that. And any sort of violation in those areas, in a jail setting, somebody on a last chance could determine whether or not that person would continue in the program. That program had a 50% termination rate every month. They cycled through 30 clients every month, and by the end of the month, the group that started, only 50% of them would make it. I then went on to work at a mental health clinic, an advanced practice mental health clinic. And there, our termination rate was 25%. Different set of rules, same population. And then as you spoke about the reentry program, at this point, we're talking a few years down the road, lessons learned. I eliminated the policy that said that people should be terminated for behavior. Part of the justification for that decision, and why corrections, law enforcement, including federal law enforcement, supported me in that, is that we knew that people not following the rules would eliminate themselves. We didn't need to be putting ourselves in a position to determine their eligibility for the program when their own conduct would be determining that, and there would be little decision-making on our part on what the outcome of that would be. Our retention rate and completion rate went up to 86%. Just let that sink in. The only difference between the three settings was the way the pen holders were pushing the pen. That's the only thing that changed. Same population, but dramatically different outcomes. That meant the vast majority of people coming to a voluntary program, not mandated anymore, who could not get kicked out for behavior, were completing the program. And before you go there and say, well, you know, that sounds like you guys were just letting anything go, we reduced the recidivism rate of the high-risk population from 28% of a mandatory program to 6% by year 1, year 2, and year 3 with the same population. Translation, 94% of the men and women that came to our program did not go back into prison between year 1 and year 3. The regular state rate is at 36% for the same population in mandatory programs. And by year 3, that recidivism rate jumps up to 76%. We also reduced the revocation rate for sex offenders by year 3 by 70%. We're going to get into some of the politics of how that was achievable. Does the way you tell your story, does it bring us together or does it keep us apart? The way we talk about certain people, the way we think and view about certain people, does that bring us together or does that tear us apart? And of course, you're going to have your inner circle, and you're going to have your larger circle. And ask yourself, how much of the way you tell yourself your story are you influencing whether you bring somebody in or keep somebody out? And do we think about these things? I remember I was the smartest. The time I was ever the smartest was when I was like around 20. I knew so much about life when I was sitting in the bottom of a prison, having survived a race riot in segregation, and I knew I had the world by the cojones. Today I realized, like, whoa, you know, when I went and got my associate's degree, I finished my associate's degree, and I remember standing on the school steps thinking that I had reached enlightenment, that there was no more to learn, that I had learned it all at this point, until I realized that what that associate's degree did was the next time I was in the field practicing, I was starting to identify and recognize things that I was blind to before, but because I could recognize them didn't mean I knew what to do about them. Now I'm running into a whole other set of problems I did not know were even in front of me this entire time. So then I said, I got to go back to school, and I got a bachelor's degree. And I was kind of frustrated because I still had a lot of questions that weren't being answered, but my teachers kept saying, you're asking the right questions. I'm like, I wasn't asking rhetorically, like I really wanted an answer to that question. And then my master's degree I realized it was a sham, and I was $70,000 in student loan debt. I couldn't even think about the answers to the questions I had under that kind of pressure. It was enormous. But I can tell you now, most of us overestimate our own self-awareness throughout life. We do. You know, and even when we're trying to be humble, our egos are pretty dominant, you know, beyond our control. And I think really the only thing that we can do is hope to catch ourselves stuck in that ego from time to time. Having said that, it means that most of us are operating and walking through life often just as forgetful as ever. We forget to take a moment to pause and think and consider and reflect on our lives and the way we're approaching life. My life has about 2 stages in general. I was really just trying to think about the major shifts in life. And I might be going into a third shift right now. But like some of us in the room, my beginning was very rough. And that wasn't by my choice, it was by circumstance. And, I would say the first 11 years of my life are still to this day the worst. And we'll get into some of that story. And then the way I handled those first 11 years when I finally started to come into my own and realized that I had choices to make. I wasn't just stuck in a home. Now I had choices because I had legs and I had a brain and I could run if I wanted to. What I did in that time period was pretty incredible. And, as they say, we are all born with infinite ignorance. And I tapped into a lot of that ignorance. And I spent a lot of time just really running around reacting to the world. And it had a lot to do with my experience, but having no one there to help me really process it in a way that I could understand. No one was speaking the language that I was speaking. And now we're at a stage where I've come full circle. I can revisit those periods, and we're going to talk about some of that tonight. But I can revisit those and see that the lessons were there, that those experiences are meaningful, that they're more than just scars, and that not only do I owe society a debt, but now I have something to contribute to society that's beyond that. I spend very little time talking about what brought me to the table, and I spend an entire days and weeks and relentless hours talking about what I bring to the table, thanks to that new experience. And if you want to know how you get from there to here, I'll be honest, I have to lay my success at the feet of the people I've surrounded myself with. No one is self-made. How many of you have ever heard of that, self-made, that term? So I just want you to know, I had a lot of help in becoming the dumbass I was. And I've had a lot of help becoming the man I am today. Nobody gets anywhere in life on their own. We always have help. And we have to reflect on what kind of help we're getting in life. I think we should all learn to tell our stories. And we should tell it over and over and over again. And the reason that is because from each time you tell that story, you should be gaining insight into yourself, the people around you, and the world that you live in. But I think it matters how you tell that story, as you can guess. And I've been telling that story successfully for the last 18 years. And that story has changed and evolved over time, just like I have. And in sharing that story, I realize it's become service work as well. Because when I tell that story, I often find that I'm helping others, that I have helped improve the lives of others, that I have been able to show people that there's a way out from even the darkest places in this world, from underneath the heaviest pressure. And no matter how difficult your life has been, to maintain hope. And hope is critical when you're suffering. Hope is critical when times are dark. And without that, I think that's how we get to these states in the world where people are so violent, because we become hopeless in many ways. I wrote a book about my life called Four Bears, and it's doing okay. It's doing well in prisons and treatment centers. The courts love it. I found out a judge was sentencing people to read it not too long ago. True story, not far from here in Milwaukee. I also was invited to Hungary in 2015 to tell my story on a TED stage. And at that time, I didn't understand how far that story would go. But to this day, I get responses from every corner of the world in every language imaginable from people saying, thank you. You've helped me see my own struggles differently. And I see the value in sharing those stories goes beyond just helping myself. Again, it goes back to that service to others that can provide light. Your story matters, and you should tell it for the sake of yourself and the sake of the people around you. I'm also the founder of an organization called Formers Anonymous. How many of you have heard of 12-step groups like AA, NA, CA? This is similar. It's based on the same model, but I want you to know, if you know anything about social work, then you should know something about social workers. Social workers do not run into a system that they don't try to tinker with. We don't believe that if it's not broken, to leave it alone. Now, it can be working perfectly fine. We still want to understand it and find some way to improve it. I've done that with this 12-step model. This 12-step model is concerned with helping men and women addicted to street life. I want to let that sink in. It's not about a particular substance. It's not about a particular behavior. It's about an entire lifestyle that is next to impossible for men and women to leave behind. And you will watch these men and women struggle and suffer and relapse and go through withdrawals in the identical ways as we think of when we think of traditional addiction. But not only have I brought that to the table, I'm bringing science, the medical model, research, and best practices to this model. And we're removing language that has driven people away from even wanting to entertain the idea of a 12-step program. So I've made significant change. I always say we, I don't know why, but I'm the one, I have to take full responsibility for its success as well as any failures that come with it at this point. But we are seeing dramatic results. Here in Wisconsin, it's become the #1 requested 12-step group for men and women in prisons. Drug courts have signed off on it. The Milwaukee Mental Health Consortium Board has signed off on it. And we're in 3 counties right now in different treatment centers, including all women's treatment centers. Some of the people from the 12-step world who are big players in that world have come to me and they said, you know, we're glad you're saying what we wish we could have always said about the program. And others are like, you're crazy, what are you doing? You know, you're messing things up. And, you know, my response to that is, you know, we're a little antisocial in the criminal world, so we really don't care what anyone's thinking about these changes that we're making, so deal with it. Students, this is for you. Faculty, some of you might be a hard sell, but personal development is a must, and it has to be ongoing. Ongoing. What was best practice 10 years ago is not best practice today anymore. And in fact, some of the best practice models of today are actually 30 years old. They're just being discovered again, and new approaches are being applied to those. If you're not studying, if you're not reading, if you're not engaged in some sort of formal personal development, you're holding yourself back. You have to stay current. A computer that is not plugged into the internet will never double its database. A computer that's plugged into the internet is doubling its database every other day. Recognize that. Understand that euphemism there. You have to stay plugged in. You have to get fresh perspectives. You have to listen to things that you normally wouldn't listen to. You have to eat things you normally. These experiences really help broaden your, I'm for real. The music, the plays you see or don't see, all of that stuff is there to enrich you. And once you start to push into those uncomfortable places in life that you're not familiar with, you'll wish you would have done it sooner. Because those experiences tend to be more enriching for you than you could have ever imagined. And you can start safe. You can start safe. Instead of always eating beef ramen noodles, try chicken. Like, stay away from the shrimp, though. That stuff, don't trust that. That doesn't even taste like any shrimp I've ever had. I know college life is tough, but you don't have to put the packet in. I'm just saying. I've never done this work for recognition. And it was a long time before I ever got a pat on the back. And I'll tell you, when I got it, it felt good for one reason. I was doing something, at least, that others knew was worthwhile doing. You never know when you're pioneering if what you're doing is worth it until someone comes along and uses the trail you just carved out in life to their benefit. And a lot of times, that's what you're going to do. Some of you are the first generation to be going to college in your families. You're pioneering for that family right now. You're improving the quality of life of future generations of your family. You've made it more likely that someone in your family will go to college after you. For some of the populations, you've decreased the chances that somebody in your family will go to jail or die violently or become addicted to a substance, including cigarettes or food. This path of self-development is important. And trust me, it might feel like you're lonely, but one day somebody's going to come along and recognize all the hard work you've done, and it's going to make it seem like it was all worthwhile. But I also think it speaks to how forgiving and how loving a community can be, a national community included. Life After Hate is an organization comprised of all former white supremacists, with the exception of myself, of course. But all the founders are ex-violent extremists. And in the same year that this administration took our funding to combat violent extremism, The United Nations called us to come to their meeting, their General Assembly, and gave us an award for our humanitarian efforts in fighting violent extremism. Somebody called us a hero in that meeting, and we said, we're not heroes, but we're a part of the solution, and we're happy to be here. That says something about what the world sees in us. That the world, the bigger picture, the larger community said, you know, ex-criminals, ex-extremists, ex-violent offenders can play a role in this fight, can play a role in this community, can be viable. This goes beyond being a productive member of society, because we are now at the tip of the spear. We are now a leading voice on an international level. And people from all over this world are behind us, kings, queens, prime ministers. Now, I could focus on the fact that this administration isn't behind us in that way, but I choose to see it a whole different way. The world is behind us, so what is one person's opinion about what we're doing in comparison to that? Now, does the way I'm telling myself that story matter? A picture can hold an entire moment of time in what it symbolizes. You can look at a picture and see a whole summer. You can remember the 2 weeks of hell your kids put the last time they were on Christmas vacation with you. Like, they give you these 2 weeks on Christmas, guys, but you know your parents still got to work. Y'all make it tough on dads out here. I'm just telling you. Like, my kids come home and it's got to be all about them. I'm like, I still got to work, and then they make me feel like I'm abandoning them. I'm like, you want presents under the tree, right? Like, I've got to go to work. But having said that, these pictures, these symbols, what they mean, the rings on your finger, the necklaces that you have, those are all symbols. They all represent something, a bigger story, that in that one little thing, in that one little picture, you can remember an entire era. But we also recognize that words have value and words have meaning. And Confucius said, each word has 5,000 meanings. And when you find that it's difficult to dialogue with others, it's probably because we don't feel like we're being understood, and it's probably because we don't understand what we're hearing. The key to communication is to be skilled in what you're talking about and what you're saying, to have the right intentions behind the idea of having this conversation, and then treating people in a respectful, timely manner. And as they say, treat people as you want to be treated. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think we need to treat people at the very best that we can at all times, regardless of how they're behaving. And we'll get into the science of that in a second here. But nothing makes someone feel heard, listened, or cared for better than someone who is skilled and there for the right reasons with the right heart and the right mind. It's the difference between a doctor who does your exam, who makes you feel comfortable, and the doctor who does your exam and now you feel like he's on your hit list. I mean, that when you're at my age, they do things to you, man, that it's painful. And the last thing you want is somebody giving you the cold shoulder. Well, it's not like I want them to hug me either. It's not like that, but it's somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere we need to be. It's rough. I'm still trying to adjust. If a picture can hold so much meaning, and these words hold so much meaning, how come not enough of us are asking what behaviors represent, what they mean? A lot of times we judge these behaviors, but we don't look for the meaning behind these behaviors. And without that understanding, how can you dismantle it? How can you intervene? How can you provide a service if you don't understand why someone is doing something? Case in point, we're going to get into my life story, and I'll kind of jump ahead. I spent more than a couple of years, 15 and a half years in prison. Of that 15 and a half years in prison, about 12 of that was in segregation. Why am I telling you that? I am a father. I have 5 daughters. I have 2 sons. What did prison teach me about being a father to sons, much less 5 daughters? Why do I say that? When my daughter was around 2, if you've ever been around 2-year-olds other than yourself, these are the most vile, disrespectful, antisocial sociopaths on the planet. And the one word they know is no. And I remember having a battle. We were about to fist fight. And my wife at the time comes up to me and she's like, "What's wrong? Like, what's going on?" We're trying to intervene, right? Standing in between us. Kid's not backing down. I'm not backing down. And I'm like, she's disrespecting me. Now my wife had a way of putting things into perspective. She says, "Sammy," this is why we divorced, because like she cocked her head a certain way, just let me know she was about to dismantle my whole world. I can only handle that so much. She says, "Sammy, what 2-year-old wants to disrespect your big ass?" And when, it was crystal clear when she said it. I didn't appreciate it, but it was crystal clear. Then I go to school like the next day. You don't make this stuff up. In my human growth and development class. F that guy too, right? He says that kids go through these developmental stages, and at 2 years old is when a child is starting to create an identity and separate from the parents, because the kid identifies the 2-year-old or identifies the parent as a reflection of self, right? It's an extension of self. It's not two people in the room. It's, oh, that's me over there, right? And at 2, something happens in the brain where the kid says, "Oh, that's not me. This is me. I can speak for myself. Hey, stop putting the peanut butter sandwich in the VCR." True story. "No." And then puts the sandwich in the VCR. So this is why we're about to fist fight. It's about to go down. However, while I was at school and the teacher's doing that lesson, I started to understand why my daughter was saying no. See, there's nothing in prison or on the streets or in the gangs that teaches you that kind of stuff, right? And to be honest, I have found out a lot of parents who haven't had my experience don't know that stuff right there. This is why they're smacking their kids. This is why they're hitting their kids. This is why they're screaming at their kids. This is why they make them sit in the corner for 8 hours at 2 years old. A lot of parents don't know this stuff. It's not a manual. Here in Wisconsin, you got to have a license to have a dog, but anyone can have a kid. It's crazy. No permission needed. Do you know, UN award winner here, I was denied an application to adopt a cat. I got 7 kids, just saying. When we look at behavior and we look, I'm sorry, I mean, this is like, you can't make this stuff up. And the way I'm telling this story, trust me, it was in tears the first 10,000 times I told the story. It was out of frustration. My hair is short for a reason. My therapist said you can't pull it out so easy. When we observe certain things in the world, it can seem very simple and straightforward. And we think that we've seen enough to know enough. And that's dangerous, because once we think we know enough, we stop listening, we stop inquiring, we stop being inquisitive. We don't really want to know anything else. But what we know about life is that it's always much more complex than that. It's not just a 2-year-old being defiant. It's not just a person blurting out racial slurs. It's not just a man hitting a woman. It's not just somebody cheating on somebody else. There's typically reasons why these things happen. Now, these reasons don't lend themselves towards having excuses for these behaviors. But what we want to do is have an understanding of why these things are occurring so that we can intervene, and so that we can have responses that lead to progress and lead to change, not just compliance. See, when I tell the 2-year-old no, and I slap her on the hand, what I'm going to get is compliance, but that child has no understanding, and I have no understanding anything further than what's just happened. I haven't taught the child where the peanut butter sandwich goes, in her mouth or on the plate or back on the counter. But I think I've taught a lesson with my limited understanding, assuming that it's really her with a limited understanding. It's quite complex. Knowing that allows us to start understanding. Go ahead. That poor guy, he's got to pay close attention to me the whole night. Doing great, bro. Somebody should get him a chair. It's going to be a long night. I'm just teasing. I got 3 more hours. You good? He's like, oh my gosh. Every behavior has a meaning. Every behavior. And that's hard to acknowledge that when you're passionate or when you're really emotional about whatever is happening, or when you assume that you know enough. You know, there are therapists out there, social workers, counselors, outreach workers, that read a case file and think they know enough to start forming opinions. There's law enforcement out there that reads your record and assumes they know the whole person, enough about you to form an opinion. Teachers too, students too. That type of globalization is really in the face of our own inability to maintain that awareness that there's more to the story than what we know, and that the way we're telling the story really could affect the way that we're thinking about it and experiencing that, and then affect the outcomes. I'm going to use my own life as a case study to kind of highlight these points that we've made. We see a lot of images. Some of them may be disturbing. The content of this story can be disturbing, but trust me, you know a little bit about the ending because I'm standing here with you. This little boy and this little girl, that's my brother and my sister. This article that you see on the screen is dated January 5th, 1969. It says, on January 5th, 1969, my mother took a Tonka truck and beat my brother with that metal truck. She fractured his skull, caused paralysis down the right side of his body. I was born May 1st, 1969. So my story of violence started while I was still in the womb. I didn't discover this article, I didn't discover this life of this young boy until 2010. Meaning that my family kept that entire story, that entire event, a secret from me. Multiple people were complicit in hiding that event and that story and that life. The children that you see here are all experiencing similar fates. The physical abuse is excruciating, it's torturous, it's maiming, it's life-altering. At this age, I'm in school, maybe second or third grade, and I've already started to create a name for myself. In my report cards, it says, I'm disruptive. I raise my hand inappropriately and at the wrong times and too often and too much. I need to go to the bathroom too much. I blurt out answers. I talk too much. I don't talk when I'm supposed to. I isolate. I don't get along with my playmates on the playground. I'm in speech class and I have a speech impediment. In all of those pen strokes, there was never a question about why. Not yet. What they were doing was identifying my behavior. And those identifications led to classifications, and those classifications led to outcomes and strategies by the school to try to correct my behavior. But what were they trying to correct, and how effective would it be in the face of what they didn't know? A couple years later, maybe I'm in the third or fourth grade at this point, how many of you were ever sent to the corner store for a parent for like bread, eggs, milk, cheese, right? It's a pretty common occurrence. So from this apartment building to the store that you see here, my parents would send me there routinely to get them cigarettes, whatever it was. And my family had like an account there. So my dad would pay the bill at the end of the week, right? And my family was dirt poor, so they didn't have like a huge credit limit, but you know, back then it was still something. Now, when I was going to this store, right in the beginning of this store, when you walk in the door, there was this rack of Little Debbie snack cakes. And I don't know why, I don't know what happened. I put some puzzle pieces together a couple weeks ago when I went to Texas to visit family, but I spotted these pecan pies on the shelf. And this is an important part of the story. Stay with me, right? These pecan pies were those little bitty ones with the little silver little pie tray on the bottom, and it looked like a whole pie, but it was really only about that big. And they cost a nickel. Now, I clearly could have taken a nickel off the top, could have been skimming the whole time. But what I was actually doing was eating the pie in the store while I was shopping, and then like strategically, stealthily placing the wrapper behind some object. Eventually, after a summer of doing this, while I was trying to strategically place a wrapper in this milk cooler, this very exact milk cooler, someone was standing behind there waiting for me to do it. So when I reached into the cooler and I'm dropping the wrapper, he grabs me. Now you can imagine a small child being grabbed. You're not being grabbed by a person, you're being grabbed by like some sea monster, right? And you're about to die. And I'm screaming, he's screaming, and the staff comes out, they pounce on me, and they pretty much tackle me, stand me up, and drag me to the back of the office. And the office is more like a closet. It's kind of tiny, but it's big enough for a desk, barely. And then on the back wall is like this huge chalkboard. And somebody has drawn like calendars on this chalkboard, and it has X's on the days they must have found wrappers. Now this is where I knew my path was leading. On the top of this chart, it had the Pecan Bandit strikes again. I had a wanted poster and a villain already. Wasn't even out of elementary school. And right next to that, my reward, the very worst part of the whole ordeal, was that $89 tab for eating those nickel pecan pies. Now, imagine yourself as a case manager or a social worker or a teacher or the officer that has to be called to come and get you. And imagine how you think of that boy that's done that, who's now being arrested, and then has to go to school the next day with a parent telling you, this little SOB has been shoplifting all summer. And imagine your reaction to that. Imagine what your intervention might be, what your next few words or your approach, or how you might make a recommendation based on what the parents are reporting to you. Fast forward about 6 years. At this age, I'm 13 years old. I've been a homeless, throwaway, runaway kid for the last 2 years. By the time you see this young man here, I've buried my first child at the age of 11 with another 11-year-old girl who miscarried in her 9th month. I'm in a gang. I've been to mental institutions. I've escaped mental institutions. I've been on the run. I've dropped out of school since the 5th grade. And I now have a criminal record that would probably rival many adult records at this point. And I'm on quite a few drugs. Within hours of leaving home for the first time, I ran into people who took me in as friends, and they immediately started to show me how to break into houses and cars to survive on the street. So with never having committed a crime, I was not a street kid even before that. My parents didn't let me go outside and play. I had no friends. I had no family in the area. I was literally leaving home from a family that I knew but who was trying to kill me into the unknown, and I felt it was safer in the unknown, and my process of devolution was rapid. It was rapid. On this particular day, I've been arrested, and so they take me back home, and a lot like what you see in this picture, my mom sits in between. She takes my place, and she sits in between my two brothers like I'm sitting. My father gets behind me, and he forces me to my knees in front of my mother who's sitting on the couch. And my mom has a purple Avon brush in her hand. And some of you might not know what Avon is, but it's like the maker of the world's hardest Avon brush ever. It's like, this thing did not break. And my mother wanted me to say something. She was going to use this as a chance to try to come in between me and my brothers. Now at this point, I have never confronted my mother. My biggest confrontation was leaving. That's how I confronted what was going on in my house, was leaving. But now, I have to draw the line. When my father forced me to my knees, he stood on the back of my legs to pin me to the floor, and he held my arms behind my back. And my mother wanted me to tell my brothers that the reason I run away from home was because I don't love them. And for the first time in my life, I purposely talked back. What my mom would say, I was talking back. When I said, the reason I leave is because you do this stuff to us. And she hit me in the face with the brush. And this went on for the better part of 30 minutes. And as you can imagine, eventually, and my two brothers watching it, as you can imagine, eventually I had to give in. And as soon as I said, I leave because I don't love you, I felt something break inside of me and change. I think I went from being hurt and angry to starting to become hateful. And I remember thinking how I wanted to kill my mother in that moment for what she was doing. The oldest of the young boys here did something that looked a lot like what my mom would do. As soon as I said it, he jumped off the couch and started windmill punching me in the face while my father held me still. When he was done, because he was tired, my mother tried to force the younger boy here to hit me in the face, and he was refusing. He was pulling his hand back, but my mother took his hands and made him hit me in the face. Fast forward to the next day. What do either of these boys look like? No, not yet. Sorry, go back. What do either of these boys look like in school the next day? Well, as you know, I was already the asshole kid. I already had that. A judge actually told me, if I can't lock assholes up, but you're on my list. That taught me a valuable lesson that I could get away with a lot of stuff. But the younger boy would go to school, and he was almost like the ideal student. He didn't need any maintenance. He did his work, kept his head down, didn't need a lot of help, was smart enough, didn't cause any problems, wasn't well known, but wasn't a problem either. My other brother became like a superstar. Straight A's, lettered in sports, went on to become a federal marshal when he was an adult. I, on the other hand, went back to the streets and continued to commit crimes and get locked up for it. In this photograph, my niece, my sister's kids, are holding a picture of me. I'm 17 years old. I've just survived a race riot in Menard Correctional Institution in Illinois. I was supposed to go to prison for a period of 8 months. By the time I got to this maximum prison, it was for fighting so much. I was a fighter. I was fighting for anything and everything. As they say, pick your battles, I picked them all. I wanted to fight anything and everyone. And for the record, I wasn't a good fighter, but I was a scrapper. I just didn't care. So I land in this maximum security prison, and in this prison, a race riot is brewing. There's racial tensions. And in this particular prison, it's the only prison where white supremacists are housed safely and by the numbers, because of the rest of the prisons in Illinois are controlled by the black and Hispanic gangs. So this is the stronghold for white supremacists, who were being led by Aryan Brotherhood at that time. And if you weren't a part of a white supremacist group then, when you were brought into, you were forced into a prison-based gang called the Northsiders, which was a white supremacist group. But AB wanted to keep it pure, so they kind of forced these guys to create a prison gang that they could control, while not allowing them to infiltrate their groups. And then you could see them going through all these rituals. Like, they would put them through these punishing, grueling exercises like hazing, as a way of toughening them up, because some of these kids literally were driving a tractor the day before they got to the prison. Like, they weren't a part of any movement, they weren't a part of it, but they needed to toughen them up to kind of fit the role and increase their willingness and likelihood of being violent. When that race riot kicked off, I was 90 days from going home. That's considered to be a short timer. Whenever you hit 90 days, things are supposed to change for you, because your guys are going to try to protect you so that you can go home. They're not going to ask you to do anything crazy because they want you to go home. And my friends came to me and they said, you know what, you should lock down. This is about to go down. And I think for two reasons I didn't want to do it. One, I didn't want to be seen as weak or afraid, to be honest. I wanted to maintain my image. And two, I loved some of these men like family and brothers. I grew up with some of these men. Our orders were that when the shooting outside started, we were to attack the whites. Now, the only problem with this is that in this particular prison, you're outnumbered 10 to 1 easily. And so when they closed the doors, when the prison realized what was about to happen, they started closing doors, sections of the prison, to trap you where you're at. There were 10 of us and about 30 of them. And we had put our backs against the wall, with the exit being that way, because we didn't want anything or anyone coming up from behind us. When the shooting started, we started fighting. Now, in Illinois prisons, unlike Wisconsin prisons, the guards have the ability to shoot on the outside and the inside of the prison cell hall, because they have catwalks that circle the entire building that can do double duty on the inside and outside. And you can't access them because, they're like 30, 40 feet up in the air. So when the shooting started outside, we started fighting the inside, and eventually that guard made his way into the building and shot. And when he shot, everyone scrambled. It was just run for your life kind of thing. And my friends made it past the group to the exit, and I got pinned against the wall. And if I would have poked my head out, the guard could have shot me, but I also realized that he's got to go back outside. These men are going to come get me. And that's exactly what happened. And when these men, when he went outside, these men came at me, and I'm fighting for my life. I pretty much resigned that I was about to die. I knew I was going to die in that moment. There was no way out. There was no escape. As you scan this article, you'll see that a young black man was shot and killed. I knew him as New York. New York saw my position. Now, I was armed. I had 2 knives, one in each hand. The group of 30 men that I was fighting were all armed with knives and spears and metal chairs and mop ringers and anything that could hurt you. New York jumped into that fight with his fists. He was unarmed. When the guard came back in and shot, out of the 32 of us standing there, New York is the one that got shot. I certainly felt the sting of pellets on my back. I knew I was bleeding. I had a knife sticking out of my arm. Everyone's scattered, but I'm now in shock at what I've just witnessed. And my friend is screaming for me to help him, and the guard is threatening to shoot me if I touch him. At this point, though, there's no reason, there's no rhyme, there's no sensibility. I knew I couldn't leave him there. If I left him there, I knew that these men would drag him in the cell and torture him some more. So I grabbed my friend and I dragged him 150 yards to the other side of the cell hall. And the entire time, that guard is walking with me at the end of his gun. And when we get to the end of the cell hall, a warden walks in, and he's surrounded by security. And I beg him to take New York to the hospital, to get him some help. He says to me, "No one's coming in, no one's going out." I ask him again, "Please, he's going to die. Help my friend." And he repeated himself. Now, I understood what he meant the first time. And I understood then that this was probably because it was a black man. And I understood what was about to happen was going to change my life for a long time. And what I did was I tried to stab that warden, but because my hands were so bloody, I dropped the knife and I started fighting with him. And instead of stabbing him, I broke his jaw, I knocked him out, I started fighting with the staff. People started coming out once they saw that I was fighting, and we took over the cell hall. And we forced our way to the inmate hospital, but by that time, New York was already dead. 17-year-old gang-banging runaway kid, now about to spend the next 28 months of his life in segregation for his role in that riot, with a man's death on my conscience. Now, back in those days, we weren't using terms like radicalization, violent extremism. I didn't even know what propaganda meant. But at that point, my gang affiliation turned into racial hatred. I ended up setting a white supremacist who was next to me in the segregation unit. I burnt him with boiling hot floor wax, and then I set him on fire. I went from fighting to trying to kill people because of the color of their skin. and was willing to go to whatever extremes. Trust me, just the fact that I had something to boil something, this is prison in segregation. How did I get my hands on that? You're talking about a corrupt system where power and fear and money, you can buy just about anything. So I had help. And who do you think has access to that in segregation? You can connect the dots for yourself there. But with every day passing by, the corruption that I was seeing was fueling the hatred and justification for what I was about to become. I walked into prison a 17-year-old punk kid, and I walked out a 22-year-old dangerous man who had no regard for life, much less my own life, and who now was committing crimes based on race. We weren't even talking about race crimes or hate crimes back then. 7 months later, I go back to prison in Wisconsin here for 8 gun crimes, 4 of which, half of those crimes were against random whites that I was terrorizing just because they were white. And I went to prison for the second time, and instead of going home in 2 years, based off my sentence, I spent the next 7 years in prison, 5 of those years in segregation. I again assaulted 4 more guards in this state, and it was racially motivated at that time as well. To this day, I am known as one of the most dangerous inmates in the Department of Corrections here in Wisconsin. The hole that they held me in has since been condemned and shut down for being inhumane. In that 7 years of my incarceration, I was transferred 17 times. One of those times, when they tried to transfer me for security reasons, the prison that they sent me to saw that it was me getting off the bus and said, "That man can't come here. We're not equipped to handle somebody like that." If you're being rejected from prison and you've already been kicked out of the world, where else does that leave you to go? To be honest with you, that was probably one of the most humiliating experiences I had of my life, but I didn't even have the ability to know how to verbalize that back then. I know that I just felt a deep wound, believe it or not, and it reminded me a lot of my childhood with nowhere to go, deepening my hatred. In that time period, my daughter was born. I got to see her once before I went to prison. Go ahead. In that same time period, within months, my son was born from a different woman. And when I made it to the next prison, this is what I looked like. I walked out of that first prison, the gang leader, empowered by one of the founders of one of the most violent gangs in Chicago, and supported by most of the originators for Chicago gangs, whether it was GDs, Vice Lords, Latin Kings, you name it, all of those people were behind us, because that race riot unified all the minority gangs together. And now I have a key to unlock a lot of doors in the city of Chicago. But because I was so caught up with all that hatred, my time on the streets didn't last long. Now let's pause from the storyline for a moment. I want you to consider yourself being on the other side of a desk, holding a pen, fulfilling some role or duty in your job that requires you to interact with this guy. And imagine what that case file says. Imagine what those charges say. At the age of 22, not far from here in Dodge Correctional, a psychiatrist sat across from me, probably in his 60s. And he diagnosed me, of course, as a sociopath, and supported that diagnosis by saying, officially, on record, this man is incorrigible. Now you're in college. Do you guys know what that means? The word incorrigible? Anybody? Call it out. Incapable of change. Let me ask you something. If you take a Hippocratic oath to help others, to restore people, and you yourself communicate hopelessness in people, who is that a reflection of? Is that a reflection of me, the inmate? Or this person walking around in the world, in free society, telling himself that story about his experience while engaging with others? He, like a lot of us, assumed that from our little position, from your tiny place in the world, that you see enough of the picture to have an opinion about what you're seeing. And as you can see through this image, you will only always see a portion of the entire story. You will ever only have portions of the entire story, the entire truth. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for someone to excuse my behavior. But understanding the storyline and seeing how other people have responded to us throughout this storyline begs you to question, who is writing their story? How are they telling themselves their story? Why are they telling it that way? And does it bring people together or tear people apart? And are we aware of these answers typically? Most of us in our professions never stop to think about that. We just, kind of follow the role, follow the routine, do our job the way we were told, the way we were trained. Sometimes you're discouraged, sometimes you're encouraged. But I feel like we all have a responsibility to hold ourselves in check and to remember that what we're seeing from someone, no matter how little, how big, how hateful, how good, there's always more to that story. And before you can listen to someone else, you have to understand how you listen to yourself. We talk about great communication skills, but few of us communicate internally with ourselves in a meaningful way. We're not asking ourselves about how we assumed a position in the world. In fact, I'll go on a limb, and I'm not trying to be offensive here, but some of you inherited many of the beliefs you uphold today and have never bothered to question what those beliefs are about. Case in point, my daughters and I have thick hair. One of my kids pretty much has to use like one of those metal rakes early in the morning to get through her hair. It doesn't matter what she does to it the night before, it is a rat's nest in the morning. And I don't know where I got this custom from. I know it's in my family. But I had this belief that you shouldn't cut your hair if you're a girl in my family. And then one day I was watching my daughter literally take the brush and pretty much scalp herself, trying to get ready for high school in the morning. And, the hair is long and thick. And I'm thinking, why am I holding so fast to this rule? And I even asked some of my family members, and they're like, I don't know. I don't know why we do that. And since then, I've made my life a lot easier by not restricting what they can do with their own hair. It's made my life. So, baby, your hair looks great. You go ahead and go to school. Your friends will let you know. It ain't my battle no more, right? Tell me your friends don't tell you. Like parents who have become enlightened, they don't have to talk to you about what you're wearing because your friends will let you know when you look crazy. They will. I've learned this the best way possible. It has saved my relationship with my kids. But I do get those judging looks from parents when I drop off my 9th grader or my 9-year-old, and she is wearing every color under the sun in all the right ways. In the face of hate, in the face of anger, in the face of fear and uncertainty and judgment, do you have it within you to go ahead and treat those people in the best way possible anyway? That takes a high degree of emotional intelligence, a high degree of cognitive discipline. And when you're trying to combat that, that endless amount of ignorance that we all hold still, it can be quite difficult. And we feel justified oftentimes. But I would suggest that when we do that, we have improved the chance for a positive outcome, maybe not necessarily for the other person, but at least for ourselves and the people observing. And the opinion of the people around you should matter to the degree that the relationship exists. Why do I say that? Because a lot of times we're trying to impress people we barely know while sacrificing the views that the people closest to us would have about us if they could see our behavior. I was standing in a prison with about 2,000 inmates. Half of them knew who I was in the past. They knew of my prior gang affiliation. And I said, when I go home tonight, aside from my children, I have a cat. And that cat is going to greet me at the door for all of 2 seconds. That's what he does. Oh, it's you, and then leaves. It's not affection, but it's recognition. And I said, as long as my cat does that when I walk home, I could care less what any of you think today. Because I spent my whole life building my identity around what they would think about me as opposed to my own children. And I see that cat as an extension of my family, of my life. It represents my freedom and my relationships. And I'm doing something right when we all wake up the next day together. So while these men may have a low opinion of me for getting my act together, one of them called me a sellout, failed to recognize that I was standing in the same prison I left just a few years before. I knew that if I went home and my cat was there, everything was going to be fine. But that wasn't to say that the work we were doing together didn't matter. Because what I told them there is, I'm coming back to pull whoever of you want to come out of this hole with me. And maybe grab some of you by the neck who don't. In hopes of, right? We have to continue to treat people at our best and in their best interest as well. What if someone along this line would have done that? And someone along the line eventually did do that. When I was sitting in Waupun for my second year in a role in segregation, I had a 6-year sentence initially, and because I beat up those 4 guards, was sentenced to 2 more years for additional, so a total of 8 years. 7 of that I spent in segregation. When you walked up to my cell while I was in segregation, it looked like a hazmat warning, because they have stickers that they put all over your door to make sure that the staff who's approaching your door is amply warned about your risk and threat level. So while most men who were high risk had a 2-man escort, I had a 4-man escort. For them to open the door just to put my food through the mop hole, they had to have administrators standing there signing off, verbally saying it was okay to open that door, while I knelt at the rear of a 10-foot cell with my forehead against the wall, my hands behind my back. At this point, I was being treated with a 10-foot pole, and rightly so. Rightly so. I was dangerous. And then one day, this is when I thought I was starting to break from reality. It's not like I thought I was breaking from reality at any other point. I didn't think I was insane at any other point until this happened. One day, I'm in my cell. I'm in what's called the basement. In the basement, Waupun is a triple max security prison. And in the middle of that triple max security prison is a triple max isolation unit called the Greenhouse Adjustment Center. And underneath that triple max segregation unit is an 8-cell detention unit that is a triple max. So I am now 3 times 3 times 3 in security. And because I'm so dangerous, they have me in the basement by myself. So I can't influence the other inmates. Mind you, I am strapped to a steel cot that is 2 inches off of the floor. So I can't even move in this cell. And my light stays on 24/7. At this point, this is when I was really smart, right? Like I was like, man, I've hit the big time. Like I'm doing really great right now. You know? And this is when I started to go crazy. I heard this. That might seem so normal. But that doesn't happen in the basement of the adjustment center inside of a triple max prison, ever. No one knocks. No one needs permission to do anything to you in these environments. There is no courtesy. And then I knew I was crazy, because what I heard next, I was just ready to quit. It was a voice from a person I never knew, never seen. And he said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you." Simple. I didn't know what to say to that. What I did say was, get the F out of here. What are you doing here? Leave me alone. And then he says, "I'd like to tell you a story." Come on, man. I am a gang leader. I am a threat, right? I'm full of myself. I can do 10,000 push-ups in a day. Who's going to want to tell me a story? This did not make any sense to me. This was beyond my reality at this point. And he goes on to say, "I'm going to have them bring you to my office." That takes an act of God at this point in my life. There is no just coming down to your office at this point. It will take at least 8 armed guards to take me out of my cell, which he accomplished. Gets me to his office, which was like a 2-hour ordeal to get me there, because the way I'm shackled and chained and being escorted, I can only take those little baby steps every so often, and then I got to stop because it hurts. We get to his cell, or to his office, and he says, take it off. Take all that stuff off. These guards are totally panicked at this point. And I'll be honest, I didn't know what to make of this little short, chubby guy. Not that I'm not short and chubby, but I wasn't then. But there was something about him, and I want to tell you something that really hurts to think about to this day. I was afraid that if they took my chains off, that I was going to kill this man. So I begged him not to take my chains off. "Don't do that, man. Don't do that. It's going to be okay." And they took them off and they left. And I struggled with myself not to take the opportunity to harm him or the guards that were around me. And at 22 years old, this man told me a story. And I realized something in that moment. I had never been told a story my entire life like that. My dad never told me a story like that. My mom never told me a story like that. I won't tell you the story, but in summary, it was about how a boy becomes a man. Now, just a few months later, I beat up 4 more guards. But here's what had happened this time. I'm sitting in the hole after I've committed this act of violence. And for the first time, maybe in the last 12 or 13 years of my young life at that point, I was feeling regret for having committed an act of violence. And instead of understanding that, I was really confused by that. And then I started to blame the short, chubby man who came to my door, and I wrote him a letter. I hadn't written anybody a letter. I wrote him a letter. And I'm like, "What did you do to me? Who gave you permission to mess with my head that way? I'd like you to undo whatever you've done." And then he writes me back. He knew what I had done at this point. I didn't tell him. And he said, "No matter what you have done or what you do, I won't stop loving you." That was 26 years ago. It took me 2 or 3 more years to get my act together. But I knew I wanted to after that letter. I went on to take over a segregation unit, had my friends riot and beat up some guy. I mean, I didn't, it wasn't it wasn't a pretty change. And I struggled with wanting to change and not wanting to change. And wanting to change and knowing how to change are completely different elements in this world. And when you understand that fact, it's a little less likely that you'll judge people who fail in their attempts to change. I was asked, how many times did I try to change before I got it right? I said 10,000. I failed 10,000 times and only got it right once. And I can tell you, the vast majority of those attempts were genuine. I just didn't have what it takes. I didn't have all the skills. I didn't have all the resources. I didn't have someone behind me saying they loved me. And that came from a stranger in prison doing his job. Life After Hate has helped over 100 men and women exit these hate groups, and all of them will tell you it's the same thing. Frankie will tell you. Arnold will tell you. Angela will tell you. Tony will tell you. The white supremacist I helped chose to leave the group when he was at a rally and a black man hugged him. These aren't myths. This isn't a unicorn that we're talking about. Those of us who are lost in this hate don't know what to do in the face of compassion. We're disarmed in the face of empathy because what we expect is your hate. And there's so much of that reciprocal hate going around that when somebody is one off, it does get our attention in a big way. And it's often enough to fuel that change for as long as it takes. The man I just left in Florida, when we met with him 2 months ago, a few days later, he drank, blacked out on his Ambien, beat his wife, went to jail for 40 days, got out. Now he can't go home. He's sleeping in his truck. His job has cut his hours. One of the local hospitals refused to treat him because they know who he is, knew who he was. And he calls me in the middle of the night saying, I'm scared. You're the only person I can turn to. You're the only one who's been there for me. So I hop on a plane and I go down there and I spend a few hours with him. Half the message is, you're not alone. We love you. You've got a lot of support out here. The other half is, you can't do this alone. We've got to get you more help than what we can give you from far away. But between the love and the relationship, any resource now that we can offer him, he'll probably utilize until the end of it. When your intention is to connect with humanity, then you'll find the right strategies on how to connect those dots to that humanity. But in order to connect to their humanity, you have to be connected to your own. You have to be driven by these higher values, these higher principles, these higher narratives. And of course, I realize that one of the messages we have to send is about never giving up. No matter what you're enduring, no matter what you're facing, no matter what you've suffered through, don't give up. But that's only half the story. We can't afford to be giving up on other people too. In this political climate right now, we could just focus on what's happening in the white supremacy movement. But when we watch these rallies, the other side is just as condemning. And in many ways, one of the things we're trying to understand about why there's so much anger coming from the left, I think it comes from frustration. I think it comes from frustration of always having to feel like you're turning the other cheek and for no good reason. But if we learn anything from civil rights movement, from these activists, from these advocates, is that the only thing that separates you from becoming like the people that you're condemning is if you maintain your moral high ground or not. if you surrender your position of morality, if you surrender the very thing that you think separates you from the people that you're angry with, how are you any different? How are we any different? Of course, nobody wants to be in the face of someone who hates you because of the color of your skin, or because of your culture, or because of who you love. But do you think hating that person in return, condemning that person in any way, do you really believe that is a viable option? When we are talking about removing entire groups of people from the planet of the earth, does that or does that not sound reminiscent of periods of genocide that our worlds have witnessed throughout different eras of time? We cannot afford to adopt the values of the people that we're trying to condemn. You can't afford to do that. No one is incorrigible. And if we're writing people off, including white supremacists, including criminals and addicts and gays and lesbians and Protestants and Republicans and Trump, if we're writing people off, that speaks to our inability to maintain hope, not theirs. We have just added to the certain failure of a society who's trying to free themselves from these burdens. You don't have power over other people. Frankie recently said in an interview, he says, I went to all these rallies and white supremacists was doing all this white supremacy stuff. And he says, you know what, the honest truth is, not once did I ever duck a flying beer bottle and rethink my whole value system. No one can say it like Frankie, that's for sure. But it's true. All the anger and all the shouting, all the rejection that you might have in the face of racism, bigotry, hatred, whatever it is, all of you yelling back, all of that pointing finger, none of that is going to get the other person to rethink their life. It's not going to work. What we do know, to begin the broken record, is that when we are confronted with hatred, we're confronted with accusations, when we're confronted with a condemning narrative of some sort, we would be better served to try to understand what this person is trying to say, trying to understand what their grievance is. See, that understanding will allow you, one, to protect yourself emotionally, cognitively, from falling into the trap of reciprocal behavior. As one of my mentors says, you don't have to take the ticket, right? You don't got to jump on the ride that makes you nauseous. You don't have to do that. Speaking of that, don't change yet. Go back. No, you're good. Stay right there. Don't move. First time I took my kids to what I discovered back then was Wisconsin Dells. There was a spinning ride. And it was like a late Sunday, park was about to close, and unfortunately for me, there was nobody in the line other than me and my kids and a couple of straggler kids. And so I didn't realize that at the time, but I've gotten so old now that I can't do the spinny rides. So I'm already getting nauseous in the spinny rides, and the circus guy, clearly was a clown, was like, who would like to go again? There's nobody in the line. And of course, all the kids like, me. He's like, okay. We did it like 2 or 3 more times without stopping. I was relieving myself on both ends for about a half hour. Just saying, it was too much. Nobody was listening to me. Nobody understood my grievance. What do I mean by this grievance? Right now, when we're dealing with this white supremacy issue, there are grievances that are starting to kind of create a theme in what we're hearing from the different groups from across the nation. And just as an example, I'm not going to get into all of them, but just as an example, one of the things that our research partners have discovered is that out of the grievances, this pattern that has emerged has come from the way we talk about race issues as it pertains to terms like white privilege and white guilt, the culpability of racial injustice as it relates to the U.S. history. Excuse me. And that grievance from the alt-right, who are young, probably college-age students, is that, look, I wasn't even alive during slavery, neither were my parents. My family is not connected to Nazi Germany in any way, shape, or form. So why am I being asked to own any of that guilt, to own any of that wrong in history? Now, it doesn't matter how we look at that, if we agree with that sentiment or not. What's more important is that we've identified what they are complaining about and what they have a grievance with. And in many ways, we have to be willing to tolerate listening to that at the very least. See, because that listening leads to dialogue. But if we start off with a challenge to a grievance, we've completely on our part, have done our best to break down the communication that could have taken place. See, we've just contributed to the failure, but because we're blaming the other person, we don't see that we've contributed to the miscommunication here. We don't see how we've really just taken our ball and gone home too, in many regards. I'm suggesting that we can't be resistant to resistance. It goes with the territory, right? If you're a drug and alcohol counselor, do you think your clients might lie to you? Right, I mean, that goes with the territory, right? You got kids, they're gonna lie to you too. I have never wanted to fight anyone more than my 15-year-old daughter right now. Like, I wanted to punch her in the face so bad the other day. Like, it is battle. Like, 15-year-old girls, you guys are horrible. God, this girl can dig in like no other. And then she throws this at me, Jody. I'm just like you, Dad. I'm like, I've actually punched people in the face. I look it right in the face when I say that. They're like, whatever. Straight up. I can't even say I was abused as a child anymore. They don't let me get away with that either. Like, it's not a freebie no more. In many ways, it pays to remember that someone who feels like they're giving you a hard time is actually representing having a hard time themselves. See, that's the narrative of compassion and empathy. And are we better served by embodying that type of narrative as opposed to condemning someone for their position in the world? Go ahead. We can no longer say that if we had better enemies, better antagonists, that we could do better in the world. I learned this as a parent when my therapist said to me, you can't say you'd be a better dad if you had better kids. And I'm like, I pay you for this type of insult? But the point was so valid that I realized that my parenting was designed to get the results it was getting. So if I'm in a communication battle, I'm contributing to that. And remember, if we don't have control over other people, then that means that the only thing you can control in that situation is your own narrative, your own dialogue. And that means being aware of how you're communicating. And the way you're communicating is based on how you're telling yourself your story about that experience. It's not the other person. The other person is influencing you, but you have a choice on how to be influenced. The problem with dialogue is that we feel that if we're going to hold on to our position, we've got to force the other person to give up their position. That's broken dialogue. You don't have to concede a single point. And let's back up for a second. Before you even think about contributing to a conversation, I would like you to ask yourself, what kind of relationship do I have with this person I'm about to engage with? Because meaningful dialogue cannot occur unless there's a meaningful relationship. And it doesn't take weeks and months to establish. That can be established rather quickly. Right? How do we know this? Go to a restaurant and you know that whether you like the waitress or the waiter within 5 seconds of talking with that person, right? And it has a lot to do with how they just interacted with you. So you form an opinion right away about the relationship. Oh, I really like that person. Chances are once you said that, you're going to give that person so many breaks no matter what they do wrong. But if that person rubs you the wrong way, for whatever reason, you're probably going to short that person under a tip because they rubbed you the wrong way in the beginning. But it has a lot to do with the way we're interpreting that interaction. So before you even think about inserting yourself into this conversation, you got to step back and reflect on, what's this relationship like? Because, who's the fool? The fool or the person arguing with the fool? Right? And a lot of times we feel like we can wake this fool up, but if someone's asleep, you don't really talk to people who are sleeping and then expect a real response in many ways. And by sleep, I mean they have a different reality and perception of that reality than you do. But if you're not going to concede, then also in that process, do not condemn. Can you hold your ground without condemning the other person? Right? In your cage or rage, rational emotive behavioral therapy. I remember all this stuff from back in the prison days, right? They were like I statements. That's a great way to not concede and not condemn. You focus on, I hear you, my point is this, and I don't necessarily have to try to dismantle your point. When we're talking with people, we have to be careful not to use these broad strokes, right? This idea of collective shame that is coming out of research. Collective shame is when we are using broad strokes to identify broad groups. So on one hand, you could say all whites are racist, right? I've heard people say this. All whites are racist. That's broad stroke and that's collective shame. When we heard at a certain point in time, not too far in the past, someone say all Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers and murderers, and that's all that comes over here, that's collective shaming as well. And even when we talk about white privilege, and the way we have that discussion, it can lead to collective shame if it's condemning in nature. I most recently heard someone try to address this issue in what I thought was a step in the right direction. He was saying, look, if you are white and you believe that there is some privilege allotted to you solely based on that, we don't want you to feel ashamed. We don't want you to feel condemned. We don't want you to feel that we're singling you out. But if you could leverage that to lend itself to our cause, we would welcome that. And I thought, wow, if we had been having a conversation that thoughtful, that careful, but is a lot better than saying, your ancestors are responsible for the political climate today and you owe a debt. It's your responsibility to jump in and fix this problem. Right? That's a very different approach. And the alt-right, this far-right group that's emerging on the West Coast and influencing all the way to the East Coast, they're saying that because of that collective shame, they are now being targeted. Now, it doesn't matter if you agree or not with the statements, understanding where they're coming from and understanding that the way to have certain conversations matters. And we don't need to shame or condemn people in the process of trying to have those conversations. But we do at some point need to address the grievance. Can you address the grievance before you try to hold your position? Is that possible? My girlfriend has taught me this. I'm still a fact guy. I will draw a chart quick in an argument. And I will show you the timeline. And my girlfriend will pull one of these. No! It's about how I'm feeling. Well played. Well played. And what she's really saying is, you have your points, you have your facts, but I'm feeling a certain way, and if you could attend to that, I'd probably be more willing to hear what I did that offended you. When I interviewed the white supremacist who left after he was hugged by a black man, I asked them both, What happened? Like, help me understand. He said, well, after we hugged, we invited each other out to coffee, and for the first time, they're both saying this, right, about each other. And for the first time, I was listened to. Like, he heard my part, and I heard his part. Nowhere in there was there anything about, well, we played verbal chess, or I discounted his reality. They simply heard each other. And to that point is this point. Listening to someone is validating the person. That's how you take care of relationships, when you can validate a person. That is not to be confused with validating their experience. You don't have to agree with their experience. You just have to respect that it's their experience. It's their subjective reality, just like it's my subjective reality. And when I listen to that person, quite often that person starts to feel as if they've been heard. Go ahead. In 2010, I was reunited with my daughter in April after 22 years of separation. She was the little girl in that red dress. When I went to prison at 17, her mother told me I would not see her again. And it wasn't in 2010 that I saw her. And she found me because of the work that I was doing. And she found me because I would put messages on the internet, even before I knew how to use the internet. Believe it or not, in 2000, the internet was brand new. People were still using word processors and floppy disk drives. You guys don't even know what that is. It's not the thing you play tennis frisbee with or anything like that. And then in August of 2010 is when I discovered I had an older brother after 45 years of being kept secret. And I drove to Texas where they both lived to visit them, and that's when I saw that pecan being held by that squirrel, and I wanted it back. And what that picture represents to me is taking my story back. I can't take back what's been done to me, and I can't take back what I've done. But what I can do is change what all of that represents to me. Things don't just happen for a reason. Things just happen. We assign meaning and value to those experiences. And no, hold on. Yeah, one more. One more. I'm asking you to consider whether or not you are aware of the way you tell yourself your story about your experience with yourself and with others. Does it bring us closer together or pull us further apart? Why do you tell yourself your story in that particular way? And are you aware of these answers to these questions routinely? My one takeaway point is that for those of you who have suffered and who have struggled and who may still be suffering and struggling, the things that held you down will one day hold you up. You have to take control of your story and write the value and the meaning that it has. Don't feel that life is what is assigning that to you, though. The very worst things that have happened to me and that I've done are now what I'm using for service work and to help others. But it goes beyond that, because once you tap into your own self-worth, that opens up the rest of this world for you to accomplish just about anything else you set your mind to. In the face of hate, in the face of hurt, the only thing that can dismantle hate is your humanity. And we're asking you to put that humanity to use, whether it's on this campus, in your personal lives, or in your professional life. Thank you again, Ripon, Jody, for having us here, to all the staff and faculty, Michael, for helping arrange this, and for those of you who sat here for an hour and a half listening to me talk, thank you. I appreciate your sacrifice. I appreciate your attention, and look forward to hearing from some of you down the road. Thank you, and have a good evening.